In this video, we're going to talk about Great Eastern Cutlery made Tidioute Cutlery TC Barlows, and specifically this number 15 Sheepfoot, which was originally in smooth ivory bone. And these are special factory orders by Charlie Campagna, and they're one of the most sought after Great Eastern Cutlery knives that they make. They've been made in quite a few different variations, mostly the number 15 pattern, which this is, but also the number 14 pattern, which is like a little bit smaller version of this. And I've had quite a few of these, but this is the first one I got, and this was actually the first Great Eastern Cutlery knife that I got. I believe I got it in 2013, that's when it was made. And it's what got me into Great Eastern Cutlery and really back into traditional knives in general. So let's take a look at it here. It was originally smooth ivory bone, and I really liked that bone color, but after using it, carrying it, I really only carried this knife when I was carrying a traditional knife for a couple years, or mostly at least. It got pretty dinged up. It was getting, a lot of oil discoloration on the handle scales. So for whatever reason, and I wish I hadn't, I decided to try the T bath that a lot of people online talk about, that gives a little bit more a nicer even coloration to their bone handled knives. And it went terribly. The handle just looked awful. It was just kind of dark and more of a discoloration, like a uneven, splotchy, and I really hated it. I really felt bad that I had done it, because this is a knife that you don't really see them for sale in good condition, or really any condition, and when you do, they're really expensive. So to give you an idea of what it originally looked like, this is my Great Eastern Cutlery number 78 American Jack in smooth white bone. So there are, different versions of GEC's undyed cattle bone. This is what they call smooth white bone. This was what they call smooth ivory bone. And I thought for a while that they had stopped using that name because of, so that people didn't think that it was ivory, which is, has all of the legal things going on with it, and, ethical and everything. So they didn't want people to think that it was ivory when it's actually just undyed cattle bone. But then recently, or I guess somewhat recently, they made the number 13 office knife and called it smooth ivory bone also. So not sure what the difference is between the smooth ivory bone and this white bone. I think that the white bone does have a little bit more dark spots usually, but this is pretty close to what this looked like originally. And after I did that tea bath, I decided that it looked so bad I might as well dye it a dark color, and went with black here. So I do think that it looks a lot better than it did after the tea bath. I think that the combination of black handle covers and the big bolster is pretty classy looking, definitely traditional looking. You don't see black bone handles that often, and I kind of doubt that there are any other black bone handled TC Barlow knives out there. So kind of unique in that sense. And another thing that is somewhat rare to see with these is that I've used this knife a lot, so much so that the blade is pretty worn down. And speaking of the blade here, it's a Sheepfoot. So there are a couple different variations of straight edge traditional blade shapes. There's the Warrenclyffe, which has a continuously curved slope up to the flat part here on the spine. Then there's a Sheepfoot, which has more abrupt but a rounded corner here. There's the Lamb's Foot, which has almost straight, and it's also, there's something with the angle of the tang. I'm not sure exactly with that one. I don't have any Lamb's Foot knives. And then there's a coping blade, which is just straight. There's no rounding at all. So this is a Sheepfoot, and when I first got it, I hadn't had any other Sheepfoot or really even straight-edged knives. I always thought that they didn't really make that much sense for general use. But since I've had this thing, I found that it's been very useful. I've cut food, it does fine with that. Lots of boxes, cutting cardboard, tape, everything. I mean, I've used this camping, hunting. I don't think I've ever skinned anything with it, but general, camping tasks. It works really well for everything. It's a good general EDC type blade shape. And you see here, though, that it is somewhat rounded. It's developed a little bit of belly at the tip. So you can see that it's not totally straight. Now, part of that is probably because when I first got this knife, I was not really as good at sharpening as I am now, and especially straight edge knives. And it's pretty tough to keep the tip straight. But more so, I think that it's because the tip does dull more quickly, because a lot of the times when you're cutting, you cut with the tip first, so it gets a little bit more wear there on the tip. But to give you a good comparison of what this blade originally looked like, it originally looked like that. So you can see that quite a bit of the edge itself has been worn away through use and sharpening. The tip is definitely not as pointy, and the blade is not as tall either. So, that's what happens when you use and sharpen these knives a lot. I've re-apexed the edge, so put an actual new angle on the edge quite a few times using diamond stones, because I've used it on rough stuff and everything like that. So I've always thought this was kind of interesting. One of the reasons I keep this knife but don't use it is to see the difference here in the blade shapes. This is another TC Barlow, again a sheepfoot, different handle material here, but this is much newer. And you can see that the bolster also gets some patina on these knives. It's a little grayer, definitely some nicks and stuff, but some actual patina also. And that's another thing about Barlows. To kind of start talking about what makes this a Barlow. It's all steel construction, and Barlows don't have to be all steel construction, but oftentimes they are. And I'm actually not super sure what the steel is on the liners. If you look over here, a lot of Great Eastern Cutlery knives and in general traditional knives have brass liners and pins also. The TC Barlows are all steel. I don't know, someone suggested that the liners are 1095 like the blade and spring. I don't think that they are, because in my use they haven't patinaed or needed care anywhere near as much as the blade or back spring. But I do polish this with a sunshine cloth, a jeweler's cloth, pretty often after use. So, they might be. I think that they're nickel silver like the bolster. So I think that the bolster, the liners, and the pins are all nickel silver, which is basically an alloyed version of brass. It's not very hard, but it's doesn't discolor as much as the brass does. So that's one thing that a lot of Barlows have. Another thing is this pin setup. So you can see here, this is not a Barlow. The American Jack is a jackknife. It has 4 pins and 2 kind of next to each other here. Barlows tend to have this pin setup from what I've seen, and I'm not sure exactly what the big difference is. I would guess that it kind of goes along with the general theme of Barlows, that they're cheaper knives and made to be used, that there's just one less pin, so it's a little, one less manufacturing step. Another thing here that you see that this knife has that these two don't is a shield. Now some Barlows do have shields, but I hate that. It's one of the things that aesthetically or for the looks of a knife, I think that a Barlow with a shield just looks too busy, looks like it has too much going on in the handle, especially if it has a Barlow stamp and a shield. I think it's just too much. I don't think it looks good, and I think it takes away from the Barlowness of the knife, if that makes any sense. But some Barlows do have shields. None of the TC Barlows from Great Eastern Cutlery have shields. And then coming to the main thing that makes a Barlow is the bolster. So traditionally, a Barlow's bolster is at least and usually around 1/3 of the length of the handle. So it's a lot longer, as you can see. So this knife is, I think, 3.75 inches closed, something like that. This is 3.5 inches closed, but the bolster is over twice as long. So you can see that it's a lot bigger. And that's one of the things that really sets a Barlow apart. It's supposed to make it stronger because there's more base for the pivot, And some Barlows have even had integral frames, you might say, where the liner or the liner was not separate from the bolster. It was one piece of metal. And then Queen even made some knives that both sides were one piece. They made some aluminum frame knives where both bolsters and both liners were the same piece of aluminum, and that's pretty cool in itself because one of the big things with modern knives right now is integral handled knives, like the Benchmade, I think Foray it is, and a lot of the Chinese knives, high-end Chinese knives are being made like that, and the Spyderco Nirvana and things like that. And Queen was doing it like 50 years ago, so it's pretty cool. But the main thing with a Barlow, traditionally, like old Barlows, was that they were cheap and made to be used hard. Now, these knives on the primary market are not that expensive as Great Eastern Cutlery knives go. I mean, they're really expensive, definitely, if you don't buy other Great Eastern Cutlery knives. But this knife, when I got it, I believe was $100. And looking at how much Barlow knives were 50 or 80 years ago, and how much they would have cost compared to a day's work of wages, and comparing this Barlow's price to a day's work of wages on average, I mean, when I bought this, certainly it was less because I was in college, but they're not like hugely different. But I think that the valuation of money has changed, obviously, and the valuation of knives. So they are not cheap. I mean, if you're going to buy a knife purely just because you need something that cuts, I think that one of the Kershaw knives or a Rat 1 from Ontario are probably better options than this. Even Rough Rider, you can get a knife that cuts well from Rough Rider for $10 or $15. So I don't think that anyone who's buying a knife purely so that they have something that cuts things is going to buy this knife like they used to for Barlows. But it is a really well-made knife, and I think that compared to other Great Eastern Cutlery knives, it's not overpriced. This one was actually, I got this specific knife because I saw a post on Blade Forums by, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce the username, but Eshwabach, I think. And I just had never seen a knife that looked as good as his Sheepfoot smooth ivory bone TC. And I knew nothing about them. I asked him what they were, and I think he suggested Gunstock Jack's dealer site, and there's still one left, which would never happen now. I mean, I'd say all of these really at this point are reserved before they're even beginning to be made. So a little different then than it is now, but they're still, you can still get them if you hear about them and know a dealer who's going to get them and everything, but they're a lot harder to get. And another thing here is the action on this is super nice. I mean, this has been cleaned, gotten gritty, dirty, and been cleaned. It still has just probably, I mean, I can't ask for too much more. Like I've said, this knife is probably the smoothest Great Eastern Cutlery I have, but this is pretty close. I mean, just snaps open, really nice walk and talk. As you can see, it's centered perfectly, no problem there at all. And in, again, years of use and not really going easy on it, it has no blade play at all. So really great action. I mean, GEC has been really consistent with that. And the same can be said pretty much for this. So to give you an idea here real quick, this knife, as you can see, was made in 2013. And I got it, pretty soon after it was made. So this is a few years old, 5 or so years old now. This knife was made in 2017. Same deal, everything. It just has a red saw cut handle instead of the smooth ivory. Different edge also, but the action and everything is pretty much the same. Now, I would say that it's a little bit less snappy on the close. And I don't know if that would get better if I used it as much as I've used that knife. I do think that this knife came with a little bit lighter of a snap closed. And it's not like it doesn't close. I mean, you get to about 1/3 of the way, 30 degrees or whatever, and it snaps closed for sure. It's really well centered and everything, but it is a little bit lighter, but also very smooth and no blade play. So they've been really consistent with that. And to talk about the other TCs, the 14 is just a little bit smaller. I believe it's about 3 inches closed. They did, I think, just spear points and maybe a spear point and a pen blade. They've done clip points on the 15. They've done clip point and spay blade, which was really cool. I wish I had gotten one of the yellow ones of those. They've done a spay blade. They've done Sheepfoot spear points. They did a razor, a one-arm knife. And I have one of those. I probably should have gotten it for this video, gotten it out for this video, but I forgot to. It was the Rendezvous knife in 2014 with oil sucker rod handles. And they're really, they're all nice knives. They're all very collectible. You can get them and keep them for a while. And even if you use them, you can usually, if you need to, sell them for a little bit of a profit, or at least make up your money. Which is nice, and I think that it's a really great thing that Charlie Campagna and Bill Howard have done, really making these very traditional looking and traditionally made knives and kind of resurfacing the interest in Barlows. I think that a big part of the general interest in Barlows that has come about has been from this, if not like really the originator of the interest. You see things like there's some modern Barlow style knives coming out. The collector knives, Lion Steel Shuffler, and the upcoming Dom, and the I forget what the spear point bladed one's called. And then Jared Oser has done a lot of Barlows and things like that. So I think that this has kind of brought back the interest in Barlows, the TC Barlows. And one thing that I was, not really sure on for a while was what TC was, because on some of the packaging, not on this one, but on some of the packaging it says Tom's Choice, so that would make sense. But it also says Tidioute Cutlery, and I think that I talked to Charlie about it. And he said that it is Tidioute Cutlery. It's usually the branding of the brand there, but also it can mean thanks Charlie for making these nice knives, or for designing these nice knives. So the TC Barlows are great knives. I believe that there's a run of 14s coming up. I heard that. The dealer that I asked about it said that they hadn't heard it, so I'm not sure. But keep an eye out on those if you'd like to get one of these, especially if you'd like the smaller size. So the TC Barlows, made by Great Eastern Cutlery for Charlie Campagna, are really, I think, as classic as it gets. They're what got me into Great Eastern Cutlery, and I will keep buying them, even though I've had and let go of quite a few. I wish I still had the ones that I let go of. So if you can get your hands on a TC Barlow, I suggest keeping it, and if not using it, at least enjoying it, taking it out, and enjoying how well they're made, and the fact that they're a really modern classic. So these are my Sheepfoot TC Barlows, and I think they're one of the best runs of knives ever made by Great Eastern Cutlery.